Hafide, I'm Jolene Tovis, and this is Coffee with the Candidates. Joining me today is I'm running under the Democratic ticket is uh, Fred Bordallo, who is running for senator. Thank you, Fred, for joining us here this morning. How are you today?
Good morning, Jolene. Thank you for inviting me for coffee with a candidate. I'm doing great.
That's
Thank you.
wonderful. Now, you're running for senator, and this isn't the first time that you've ran for an elected office. Can you share with us why have you decided to shoot for a seat in the senatorial in the legislature?
Thank you for that question, Jolene. I've spent so much time. I have a proven track record, with the choice of career that I've made in law enforcement, in the military. I also have worked in the business sector at the Sandcastle as a security consultant in Tumon with the Tumon industry. So, I think for the next 2 years and beyond, the legislature, the 36 Guam legislature, those lawmakers are going to need the courage and compassion, to deal with the economic issues that we're facing right now, especially with this global pandemic, COVID-19. I have over 35,000 jobs that have been lost in terms of individuals applying for unemployment. And you have businesses that are on the verge of shutting down from the effects of the economic conditions, or about to close down. And the focus is going to really be the priorities of the how we can mitigate the economic conditions that we have, not only the tourism industry, but in the retail sector. And at the same time, look at the government's finances for the 2 years. And I've had that, again, like I said, I've had that experience in dealing with a $25 million to $30 million budget as a former chief of police. And then also as a Veterans Affairs Director, I've had that sort of idea of what a lot of the challenges are going to need for veterans and healthcare areas too. There's another important issue too that I want to work on in the Guam legislature.
All right. Now, like you said, you were the director of the Veterans Affairs, and one of the things as as director of any agency is identifying appropriations and how those monies are going to be spent. Now, with that in mind, can you give an example of a government agency that has fat to trim or is using too much of the general fund revenue? And what reforms would you make to its funding?
Well, the largest government agency that draws a lot of the funds from the budget, especially now, they're working on the 2021 fiscal year budget, and that's close to be over 800 some $1 million. The largest agency, of course, is the Guam Department of Education. My wife is a teacher. She's worked there in the education system. She's an educator. She just recently retired, and I hear it through her because she's a computer teacher. So a lot of it now is about how we can have a little bit more reach for the students that are right now learning through remote, digital, having to use their digital devices in order for learning, and sometimes we have to look at the distance learning like that, but we still have sometimes the price of that, the cost of that is the students aren't interacting that they're used to when they're going to school, those social interactions. You don't want them to be too much concentrate. You don't want them to concentrate too much on those artificial communications devices when they have to strengthen their personal skills. So the Department of Education, the education piece of this is the largest area, and I sort of going to explore that. But one most important thing too is really being aggressive and looking at the federal grants, because the special funds that's part of this government budget has to deal a lot with aggressively applying for those grants. And I'm a grant specialist, a grant research specialist. So I understand that sort of like challenge for the state clearinghouse, and to have capacity with the government of Guam to make sure they get as much federal funding that and don't miss the opportunity for that.
All right. Now you raised a great point in that, right now we are in a public health emergency. And with that in mind, how would you have handled the economic crisis resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic? It has resulted in partial shutdowns. Right now, we are currently in an island wide lockdown. And so there are a lot of businesses that are hurting, both in the private sector and, of course, with Guam's own revenues being that tourism is a big part of our economic portfolio. So, how would you handle the economic crisis?
Yes, you've asked an excellent question, because I've been part of the pandemic planning way back in 2006. I'm so used to being in that emergency center up at Office of Civil Defense, the lead agency on a biological agent such as the COVID-19 and the global pandemic is public health. And I've seen so far, just like all the other states, but the governor, has really done her best. She comes from the medical background, healthcare background as a nurse. My mom is a nurse, and she used to be working for public health. She used to be also a director of GMH, and I used to accompany her when I used to work part time in the business at GMH. There's a lot of resources. You don't want to overtax the hospital that they're currently in right now if that infection spread is so wide. So the number one priority, of course, is the saving of lives, to make sure our first responders, our nurses, our doctors, they get the resources there. You don't want to overtax and overburden the hospital, and then lives are lost. Life is just so precious. That's the one thing I learned too, basically, even as a law enforcement officer in that emergency thing. And of course the price of the lockdown and being safe and trying to protect our people is the business loss there too. The downside of those business activities. That's why it's incumbent that as a lawmaker, when we look at the administration to be transparent and to give us the information of their healthcare needs at the hospital, the public health. At the same time, we're also working on listening to the private sector too, being open and compassionate about them, listening to what they need to. What could we do to sort of like mitigate their situation? And that's why I think from the federal level, the CARES Act, all the millions of dollars the Guam Department of Education is going to get, all the millions of dollars UOG and GCC will get, and also Department of Labor, De La Sola, doing his best, because there are going to be a lot of those federal revenues from the CARES Act funding that are going to be infused back to just stimulate the economy. But I think I read this book on George Sperling, an economic advisor for Obama, and it's the restoring economic dignity, because people just don't want handouts. They want to get back to work. So those are the kind of things I'm going to be focused on as a lawmaker when I'm elected into the 36th Guam legislature.
All right. Now, you mentioned federal funding, and you also mentioned that, there are a lot of people who want to get back on their feet. And you know what, there are a lot of people who are at home right now, but there are also a lot of island residents who are considered essential workers, who are working in the private sector. Um, how would you how would you move forward to try to ensure that these essential workers are also compensated for their work, which has been a big contribution to saving lives, and as well as trying to keep the spread of coronavirus to down? What would you do on that regard?
Well, I again, as I said, I've worked in the private sector as a security consultant for a company, the Sandcastle in Tumon, and one of the things too is that there are essential, the government and the business together, private-public partnerships are the ones too also that are a strategy that is used, and of course, the conversation about government first responders and their sort of like the essential pay that should have for this emergency, that is able to be that's a little bit more durable in terms of having as a lawmaker to adjust there. With the private sector, I think they don't want government intrusion to start regulating the owner of that business, how they're going to pay for their essential employee to the most that we could do too is look at minimum wage increase. That's the closest when we talk about government's relationship and their role with the private sector. And we have to, and we hear the Chamber of Commerce. We hear that whenever there's a talk about raising minimum wage, if there's a talk about the government even attempting to say you must pay your essential worker that you get back higher pay, that may cost the entire business to shut down. So there's a cost benefit analysis there, and there has to be some policy analysis. And I think that's where I think I bring that in terms of my track record, because and my the experience I have in research, because I always believe that any kind of decision I'm going to make as a policymaker, you must have that analysis first to see what are the ramifications. There could be so many unintended consequences that could happen, and we certainly don't want to lose more businesses because government reached in too far to try and regulate the business to pay their essential workers something that the business couldn't even afford.
All right.
Right?
Now, before we close out this segment, uh, in 30 seconds, can you share with us something about yourself that the general public doesn't know?
Okay. Well, I am a musician. I played in various bands. My mom had me go to piano lessons when I was 12 years old. And when you go to piano lessons, I think the teacher just really emphasized do your homework. Otherwise the song isn't gonna come out right. And I have to play by notes. And so I think that's what I bring with me is just the and I guess I just try to emphasize that although we get into the STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering and math, the arts are really going to be it's the soul of the community of music, and that's just when I want to send that message out. I'm a supporter of that.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Fred, for joining us here today. Well, don't go anywhere. We'll be back with more Coffee with Candidates after this.